The war between Russia and Ukraine continues to dominate headlines across the global information space. Debates rage on about which side is winning, but one thing is clear. Both armies have become locked in what resembles a prolonged, grinding war of attrition. Why this happened to Ukraine is easier to understand. After gaining independence in 1991, the post-Soviet Ukrainian government actively pursued demilitarization at a pace that would have astonished even Putin. Ukraine declared itself a non-nuclear state and steadily reduced the size of its army and navy. Its armed forces were expected to participate in small-scale international missions, like peacekeeping in Iraq, not to wage a full-scale conventional war against one of the world's largest militaries. Despite considerable support from its allies, Ukraine's military remains limited in size, manpower, and equipment compared to the Russian armed forces. Russia, on the other hand, has always maintained a large military, tank divisions, strategic aviation, a submarine fleet, and a vast nuclear arsenal. It also has a long and storied military history, from defeating the Golden Horde to capturing Berlin. Given this, many observers are puzzled by Russia's failure to achieve its goals in Ukraine. Some brush it off by claiming that the Russian military is simply incompetent, corrupt, or built on outdated Soviet technology. The conclusion they draw? Russia wouldn't dare challenge NATO. After all, they're losing so badly in Ukraine that they surely lack the troops and equipment to threaten Estonia or invade Finland. So there's no rush to streamline Western bureaucracies or ramp up defense production. We can keep building tanks at a snail's pace. But such conclusions are dangerously naive. The truth is, there are rational and historically grounded explanations for Russia's setbacks in Ukraine. And as uncomfortable as it may be, we need to understand those reasons. As always, the answers lie in history. In this video, we'll examine the origins and nature of Russia's military doctrine, how it has made mistakes in past wars, and how other powers have made similar mistakes of their own. To understand why Russia wages war the way it does today, we need to go back in time, to the late 19th century, when wars were still fought in lines. Soldiers in bright red, blue, or green uniforms would march across open fields, stop at full height, and fire on command. This style of combat was a legacy of the musket and smoothbore artillery era, where discipline mattered more than firepower. But this approach began to break down during the Second Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. The Boers, mostly farmers with experience in guerrilla warfare, used trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns. They skillfully used terrain and cover to inflict heavy losses on the British Army. In just minutes, entire British formations advancing in lines could be wiped out. Despite this harsh lesson, most European powers failed to adapt. When World War I broke out, the world witnessed the peak of trench warfare. Endless dugouts, artillery duels, gas attacks, and frontal assaults. Among the nations dragged into this disaster was the Russian Empire. In 1916, it launched the Brusilov Offensive, one of the most successful operations of the war. But like others, its army eventually bogged down in attrition warfare and collapsed from exhaustion. Military minds didn't sit idle, though. Officers began developing new tactics to break through static fronts. One of these tactics came from the British and French, the armored breakthrough. Infantry advanced alongside tanks, which could breach defensive lines that ordinary rifles couldn't stop. Once the line was broken, infantry would systematically eliminate the enemy behind it. The sheer terror and chaos that tanks brought to the battlefield can be seen in one of the key scenes of All Quiet on the Western Front. Two nations would later inherit and perfect this method: Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The key difference between how Germany and the Soviet Union developed their armored warfare tactics lies in the vastly different starting points each nation faced. Germany, despite its defeat in World War I and the severe restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, retained something far more valuable than weapons: its human capital. The army was formally limited to just 100,000 men, but the Germans used this period to build the core of what would later become the Wehrmacht, a cadre of staff officers, instructors, and analysts. German industry, though partially demilitarized, remained robust. Meanwhile, seasoned veterans and military theorists, most notably Heinz Guderian, were already working on the concept of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, in which tanks would serve as the primary offensive force. The Soviet Union, in contrast, was starting almost from scratch. After the Russian Civil War, the economy was devastated, and the military had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The situation was made even worse by the purges of the 1930s, during which a large portion of the Red Army's officer corps and many of its engineers and specialists were imprisoned or executed. Despite these setbacks, the USSR managed to produce several advanced weapons systems, most famously the legendary T-34. At the outbreak of World War II, this tank outclassed its rivals in terms of armor, firepower, and mobility. But these technical advantages were largely canceled out by the chaos within the Red Army's armored units. Dozens of different tank models were in service at the same time, from the outdated T-24 and T-28 to the fast but lightly armored BT-2 and BT-7. This created a logistical nightmare in terms of maintenance, repairs, ammunition supply, and combat planning. Worse still, due to a lack of trained officers, many commanders were appointed based on political loyalty rather than military competence. There were cases where individuals suited to lead a regiment or division were instead given command of entire army fronts. Under such conditions, even the best equipment couldn't be used effectively. In 1941, the Soviet Union entered World War II not as a confident superpower, but as a giant with feet of clay. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the USSR had briefly played the role of a neutral predator, seizing eastern Poland, annexing the Baltic states, and launching a bloody, albeit victorious, winter war against Finland. But when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the fragility of the Soviet military machine was laid bare. The German plan relied on rapid, overwhelming strikes. Panzer divisions pierced deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies, capturing cities, and forming massive pockets of trapped troops. The Red Army's retreat was often disorganized, more panic than strategy. Communications collapsed, orders never arrived, reinforcements were lacking. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured before they even had a chance to fight effectively. In response, Soviet command began a gradual shift from ideological fanaticism to military pragmatism. The shock of the early defeats forced Stalin to grant surviving commanders greater autonomy. A new kind of Soviet officer began to emerge, still politically loyal, but increasingly capable of adapting, learning, and taking initiative. The Red Army started learning from its mistakes. By 1942 to 43, signs of transformation were becoming visible. Logistics improved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery became more effective, and mechanized corps were formed with real offensive potential. Not just masses charging with bayonets forward. The turning point came at the Battle of Kursk in 1943. There, Soviet forces not only repelled a major German offensive, but also launched a successful counterattack, following a well-structured operational plan. By the end of 1944, the Red Army was applying principles that had once defined the Wehrmacht: concentration of force, breakthrough tactics, encirclement, and operational mobility. However, where the Germans relied on precision and technical superiority, the Soviet approach was rooted in massive numbers of troops, tanks, artillery shells, and sheer resolve. The USSR had evolved from a chaotic, poorly led giant into a formidable war machine capable of grinding down its enemy both quantitatively and, increasingly, qualitatively. While Soviet tactics on the battlefield still sometimes relied on frontal assaults and came at high cost, by the war's end, the overall strategic sophistication of the Red Army far surpassed its disorganized state in 1941. The experience of World War II, especially the confrontation with Germany's well-organized and technologically advanced panzer divisions, forced the Soviet Union to rethink its entire approach to warfare. As a result, the concept of the armored blitzkrieg, a rapid breakthrough followed by encirclement and annihilation of enemy forces, became the cornerstone of Soviet military doctrine for decades to come. However, amid the growing dominance of air power throughout the 20th century, the Kremlin recognized that future wars would not be won solely on the ground. World War II had demonstrated that control of the skies was crucial. In Washington, strategists embraced the doctrine of Julio Duhay, which advocated that air forces should not just support ground troops, but strike deep into enemy territory, destroying infrastructure, demoralizing civilians, and crippling a nation's ability to resist. The devastating firebombing of Japanese cities in 1945, not just the atomic bombings, served as a grim validation of this theory. The first direct, albeit unofficial, aerial clash between the two superpowers occurred during the Korean War. The Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps and elite American squadrons faced off in what became known as MiG Alley, the skies over northwestern Korea. Soviet pilots flying the cutting-edge MiG-15 had a clear mission: to stop American B-29 strategic bombers from reducing North Korea to rubble, just as Japan had been in 1945. This air war served as a sobering reality check for both sides. The MiG-15 proved to be a serious threat to American aircraft like the F-80 and F-84, forcing the United States to rush new jet models into service, such as the F-86 Sabre. American pilots were stunned by the skill and aggression of their opponents. Soviet pilots who, officially, didn't exist. Flying without insignia and under strict orders not to speak Russian over the radio, they represented Moscow's covert hand in the conflict. Both the Kremlin and the Pentagon drew the same conclusion: future wars would be decided in the skies before the first tank ever crossed the front line. Thus began a new era in the arms race, not just in aviation, but in missiles as well. After the Korean War, Moscow came to a critical realization: battling American air power directly in the skies was too costly and too risky. A new solution was needed, one that was effective, relatively cheap, and less dependent on pilots. The answer came in the form of surface-to-air missile systems. a new weapon in the war against Western air superiority. This led to the development of Soviet air defense systems, most notably the S-75 Dvina. The S-75 would become a symbol of Soviet anti-air capabilities during the Vietnam War. Soviet specialists, instructors, and hardware were secretly sent to North Vietnam, where the USSR helped build a dense and mobile air defense network. These systems inflicted significant losses on American aircraft. B-52 bombers and tactical fighters faced constant threats, not just from missiles, but also from layers of Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft artillery. The Doctrine, which had worked so effectively in Japan, now ran into a coordinated mobile air defense umbrella. As a result, the US failed to achieve air dominance, and the war dragged on. In response, the Americans developed countermeasures: anti-radiation missiles like the AGM-45 Shrike, electronic warfare systems, laser-guided bombs, and SEAD tactics, which stands for Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses. The climax of this air war came with Operation Linebacker II in December 1972. For 11 days, the US launched massive strikes on key targets in North Vietnam. B-52s flew deep into enemy territory. Though the air defenses inflicted losses, this time they couldn't stop the bombers. Vietnam became one of the most heavily bombed countries in history, and the world saw that air superiority had once again shifted back to the United States, but at the price of a relentless technological arms race. After the Vietnam War, the US military's image as an unbeatable force was shaken. Reforms became inevitable. They began with recruiting, transitioning from the draft to a professional volunteer army. Even more transformative was the adoption of a new doctrine: air-land battle. This doctrine envisaged that in the event of war with the USSR, the primary strike would target deep enemy rear areas, destroying Soviet air defenses, SAM systems, air forces, command centers, logistics, and reserves. The goal was to isolate Soviet tank divisions, cornerstones of Soviet military doctrine, and render them combat ineffective before they could engage the main front line. Americans also developed technologies to blind the Soviet military, from satellite reconnaissance to high-precision weapons capable of hitting individual targets from long distances. While in the 1950s to 60s, the US lagged behind Soviet advancements in SAMs, by the 1970s to 80s, the USSR itself slept through the technological leap of the Americans. The true magnitude of this lag became apparent in 1991 during the Gulf War. Americans tested their new doctrine against Iraqi forces modeled on Soviet doctrine. Within 100 hours, they had virtually destroyed Iraqi air power, paralyzed logistics, encircled and annihilated tank divisions. Saddam Hussein's army, one of the strongest in the region, suffered a crushing defeat without even mounting full-scale resistance. Why did the USSR allow such a strategic lag? Not because of a lack of intelligent people, but because decisions on projects, doctrines, and billion-dollar budgets were driven by one man's personal vision, not expert debate. A telling example: in the 1970s, a Soviet space delegation saw a US poster advertising the upcoming space shuttle. They reported it back to Moscow. Immediately, General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev convened a meeting. The military argued that a similar craft had no real military purpose. Economists claimed reusable spacecraft would cost more than traditional rockets. But Brezhnev's word was final. So the Buran project was born, which, according to some estimates, cost up to 11 trillion rubles, approximately 150 to 200 billion US dollars at the time. In a system where strategic decisions hinge on one person without rigorous expert review, errors are inevitable. The Soviet military fiasco of the 1980s was, above all, a failure of political leadership. It's also worth mentioning the Soviet Navy. During the Cold War, the prevailing belief was that the main force at sea would be nuclear-powered submarines armed with ballistic missiles. And indeed, nuclear deterrence was a top priority. However, the world never reached full-scale nuclear war. Instead, the dominant ship of the ocean became the aircraft carrier, a class that had already proven its effectiveness during World War II. While the United States expanded its carrier fleet, turning it into a mobile platform for projecting power anywhere on the planet, the USSR stubbornly refused to follow the same path. The reasons were ideological, strategic, and, most importantly, economic. The Soviet military budget couldn't compete with the American one, especially in the naval sphere, which had always been a lower priority compared to ground forces and strategic missile troops. Instead of building aircraft carriers, Moscow sought asymmetric answers. In the 1960s, during the détente period, the USSR was forced to reduce the number of its Tu-22 strategic bombers under international agreements. But engineers found a workaround. They removed the refueling systems and reclassified the Tu-22s as medium-range missile carriers. A new missile was developed for them, the X-22. Supersonic, heavy, and extremely inaccurate. However, it carried a nuclear warhead. The logic was simple. Even if the missile didn't hit the carrier directly, a nearby nuclear blast would still disable the ship. In the 1970s, the USSR eventually attempted to build its own aircraft carriers, the Kiev class. But these ships were smaller in displacement, carried fewer aircraft, ran on gas turbines instead of nuclear power, and had limited range. In practice, they were hybrid cruiser carriers that lagged behind their American counterparts in all key areas: range, firepower, aircraft capacity, protection, and autonomy. The consequences of this strategy are still visible today. The only aircraft carrier inherited by Russia, the Admiral Kuznetsov, is more a relic of the past than a combat-ready asset. It falls behind modern ships like the Gerald R. Ford class in every aspect. Moreover, due to chronic technical issues, the Kuznetsov has been stuck in repairs for years, becoming a meme even among Russians themselves. The weakness of the Soviet Navy is further proof that relying on asymmetric answers without systemic technological or industrial superiority is a strategic trap in modern warfare. While the Soviet Navy searched for asymmetric solutions, the United States doubled down on aircraft carriers. And it paid off. Today, the carrier fleet is the cornerstone of American global dominance. An aircraft carrier is not just a ship. It's a floating air base, capable of operating independently, deploying dozens of fighter jets, and striking targets anywhere on the planet, without needing access to foreign territory or approval from local governments. In addition to its air wing, American ships are armed with Tomahawk missiles, high-precision weapons with a range of up to 1,500 kilometers. These missiles became the hallmark of a new era of warfare: precision strikes without a ground invasion. These ships have participated in both wars against Iraq, the bombing of Yugoslavia during Operation Allied Force, and the invasion of Afghanistan after September 11th terrorist attacks. All these conflicts helped shape the U.S. image as a global hegemon in the late 1990s and early 2000s. with the Navy playing a crucial role. Against this backdrop, Russia appears weak. It has no operational carrier fleet. Its only aircraft carrier is out of service. The Caliber cruise missiles launched from frigates and submarines are a pale imitation of the American concept of power projection. Yes, they can fly thousands of kilometers, but they don't change the course of a war, don't force enemies to surrender, and don't create the shock and awe effect that Tomahawks did in Iraq or Yugoslavia. While the US was projecting power across the Middle East and solidifying its role as a global hegemon, 1990s Russia was fighting a very different kind of war, small, dirty, and often humiliating. Abkhazia, Ossetia, Tajikistan, and most painfully, Chechnya. These were not large-scale military campaigns, but guerrilla wars against armies that had been cobbled together literally the day before. And even in these conflicts, Russia struggled to win. After the collapse of the USSR, the Kremlin lost more than just territory. It lost the backbone of its military: personnel, officers, industry, ammunition, and motivation. Many soldiers who remained were more focused on personal gain than on fighting. Corruption was eating the army from within, and there was no leader who could slam a fist on the table, purge the ranks, and reform the system. There was no Stalin-style correction of mistakes, only drunkenness, chaos, and looting of the armed forces. The culmination of this decay came with the New Year's assault on Grozny in 1994 to 1995. Russia's 131st Maykop Brigade entered the city without maps, coordination, or a plan. It was annihilated. Tanks burned in the streets, soldiers ran in panic, and Chechen fighters targeted Russian officers with ruthless precision. And although in the 2000s Putin claimed victory in Chechnya, the second battle for Grozny is portrayed in Russia as an epic triumph. But in reality, it was a war between a major power and a regional insurgency. For comparison, in those same years, the United States defeated Yugoslavia and Iraq. Russia, meanwhile, celebrated its victory over a city the size of Boston. A striking difference in scale, resources, and ambition. August 8, 2008. For the first time since the collapse of the USSR, Russia faced not insurgents, but a regular army, albeit a small one. That army belonged to Georgia, a country that had learned from its defeats in the 1990s and built a compact modern military. It had upgraded tanks, ground attack aircraft, air defenses, missile boats, everything needed to mount a serious defense. The war lasted only 6 days, and Russia formally won. But the way it won raised alarms in the Kremlin itself. The Russian military acted slowly and chaotically, riddled with blunders. Its communication and identification systems were stuck in the 1980s. One infamous episode. Russian Su-24 bombers accidentally flew right over a Georgian air defense base while on a mission. The Georgians didn't notice. The Russians didn't either. Both sides could have destroyed each other, but neither realized what was happening. It was luck, not tactics. Russia had little in the way of precision weapons. Even when targets were identified, there was often nothing accurate enough to hit them. Bombs, rockets, artillery. It was mostly guesswork, like in World War II. The Russian approach relied on volume, not accuracy. The war was a wake-up call for Moscow. The army might have been large, but it still fought like a conscript training exercise. It was after this conflict that Russia launched a massive military modernization program throughout the 2010s. New tanks, new missiles, new doctrines. But, as we'll see later, rearming an army doesn't necessarily make it strong. Syria became the testing ground for Russia's new military. The operation began in 2015, and by 2017, Russia declared victory over the Islamic State. The main role was played by the Air Force, which conducted strikes on militant positions, mostly without risk to itself, since ISIS had virtually no air defenses. In addition to air power, Russia relied heavily on Wagner Group mercenaries. This allowed the Kremlin to avoid acknowledging official casualties and to keep the war largely invisible to the Russian public. Politically, Putin framed the intervention as Russia's version of Desert Storm or Operation Allied Force, a short, efficient, victorious campaign meant to showcase Russian strength to the world. But there was a catch. ISIS had no air force, no navy, no real air defense systems, and relied on guerrilla tactics. This wasn't a war against a military. It was the aerial suppression of irregular fighters, with only occasional ground combat. Russia won, but faced no equal resistance. And when dozens of Wagner fighters were killed by US forces in 2018, it became painfully clear. Fighting a real army is an entirely different challenge. In 2014, Russia took its first major step toward full-scale war. It annexed Crimea and ignited a conflict in the Donbass. GRU special forces, artillery from Rostov, tanks without insignia. All became elements of a hybrid war in which Russia denied involvement while actively arming and coordinating separatist forces. Ukraine responded with an anti-terrorist operation and initially achieved some success, liberating Sloviansk, Mariupol, and Kramatorsk. But by 2015, regular Russian troops began intervening openly. Ukraine suffered defeats at Donetsk airport, and the Battle of Ilovaisk became a national tragedy. The Minsk agreements followed, freezing the front line without resolving the underlying conflict. Meanwhile, Russia was watching other wars. In 2020, Azerbaijan launched the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, using drones and speed to shatter Armenia's entrenched but outdated defenses. Turkish Bayraktar drones demonstrated how new technology could redefine the battlefield, weapons Ukraine would soon adopt. For Russia, this was a warning. Nations once defeated were preparing for a comeback. Ukraine, battle-hardened and rapidly modernizing, was becoming a serious threat to Russia's puppet regimes in the Donbass. The Kremlin decided to act. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion. But the plan was built on fantasy. That Ukrainians would panic and flee, that it would unfold like Crimea. Troop convoys carried riot police, parade uniforms, and flags for a quick victory march in Kiev. A parade instead of a siege. But air support never materialized. Precision strikes were sluggish. The advance was slow and disorganized. Cities didn't surrender. Ukrainian forces struck flanks and rear columns. Javelins, mobile teams, and ambushes decimated entire convoys, forcing Russia to retreat from the north. It echoed the miracle on the Marne in 1914, where Germany's offensive on Paris collapsed due to overextended lines and fierce French resistance. Ukrainians, too, proved they were ready not only to defend, but to win. Russia practiced airstrikes on guerrillas in Syria. It missed the next phase in the evolution of war. The goal of any war is gain. Land, resources, people, political dominance, all of it is meant to offset the costs of war. That means a war that drags on, inflicts excessive losses, and brings no strategic result is ultimately a failure. The true strategic objective isn't to grind both armies down in endless trench warfare, nor to terrorize civilians by bombing schools and hospitals, actions that only fuel hatred and resistance. The real aim is to destroy the enemy's army, break its defense industry, and paralyze its command structure. These are the principles by which the most effective armies of the modern era have fought. Russia's so-called special operation has achieved none of these goals. It has become bogged down in a long, exhausting war, with no quick victory and no clear strategy in sight. But that doesn't mean Russia is weak. This is a country with a deep post-imperial trauma and ambitions that stretch far beyond the Donbass. It has resources, weapons, an industrial base, and a nuclear arsenal. Most importantly, it has the will to adapt, learn, and correct its mistakes. And mistakes are not unique to Russia. The West, too, has blundered, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. Europe cannot afford complacency. History shows that new wars often begin when people start to believe the old ones can't happen again. And if Russia doesn't collapse from within, it will try again. Perhaps not against Ukraine. Perhaps against someone else.